Surprise, surprise, friends, it's me, and it's time for a weekend special. Stand up. That's right, everybody. I had a great conversation with Eric Segall last night about the Second Amendment and guns and where we're at given recent decisions, and I thought, I got to bring this to the weekend. I got to drop it right away because these are always great conversations and fun for, I think, a weekend listen. I don't know why I would say that more about this conversation than any other. It just seems like the kind of thing you say to sell a thing that you put out on the weekend. You know, it's a little bit longer form or it's a little bit different style than what we usually do in the magazine or on the podcast. It's not. It's me and Segall talking like we do, mostly about the Supreme Court and the Constitution, but also a little bit about his bladder and urinary tract. Because Eric Segall is one of my best friends, and he did a whole, I think, hour here talking about passing the kidney stone not too long ago, and it was one of your favorite conversations. Because guess what, folks? Here on Stand Up, we talk about everything that's important to a lot of people, including, in that case, men's health. But today, it is about the guns, folks. Really great conversation. I learned a lot. Gets a little bit in the weeds in terms of legal stuff, but I like that when he's talking. If it's somebody else, I don't think I'm as interested, and I think that's what one of the many things that makes Eric Segall special, not just because his bladder is made of chainmail. Anyway, of course, he is a Supreme Court scholar, a constitutional law scholar. He is the author of two really important books, Supreme Myths, Why the Supreme Court is Not a Court and Its Justices Are Not Judges, and his second book, most recently, Originalism as Faith, which presents a comprehensive history of the Originalism debates. He is a common law a common law scholar, a common law professor, or even more specifically, the Ashe Family Chair Professor of Law at the Georgia State University. And of course, you can listen to his podcasts. Can't even say the word, really. It's called Supreme Myths. Great show. I like to think I influenced him in starting that. He's on Twitter still at eSpinSegall, and you should follow him on TikTok. Yeah, he does like videos, informative videos, digestible little videos on TikTok. Go follow him there. He's actually a pretty big deal. But let me just read for about a minute and a half. It'll be good, I promise you. From Ryan Bussey's piece in The Atlantic a little while back, last year, just to set this conversation up, because I do think it needs a little context and importance from the point of view of not a con law scholar or legal, but just in terms of what this means for guns and violence. And so Ryan Bussey, writing in The Atlantic under an article titled One Nation Under Guns, How This Year's Supreme Court Ruling on Second Amendment Rights is Changing Everything. Ryan, who's a former firearms executive, joined me several times in the show, longtime listener of the show, writes, since the horrific murders at Sandy Hook Elementary a decade ago, America has seen hundreds more mass shootings, a sharp rise in gun deaths generally, and an alarming turn towards gun-glorifying political extremism. Yet we still depend on hundreds of laws that keep guns out of crowded public places, stop teenagers from buying handguns, and prohibit criminals from arming themselves with assault rifles. Now, because of a recent Supreme Court ruling, many of these remaining regulations are in danger of being dismantled. As bad as America's gun violence problem is, it could be about to get much worse. Less than 2 years after the appointment of President Donald Trump's third pick for the U.S. Supreme Court created a 6-3 conservative supermajority, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the majority opinion in the case New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. v. Bruin. The court could have issued a narrow decision and directed New York to be more lenient in issuing concealed carry permits. But as the Dobbs v. Jackson decision on abortion, which came a day after Bruin this year, the conservative majority seized an opportunity not to adjust precedent incrementally, but to destroy it completely. And for public safety and gun policy, the Bruin opinion is proving nothing short of seismic. Even as the nation struggles with yet another series of mass shootings, courts across the country are rushing to deal with a spate of lawsuits and motions that will create regulatory chaos over firearms. Many of these cases are tailored to produce appeals that may ultimately go up to the Supreme Court, predisposed to the broadest possible interpretations of Second Amendment rights. You should go read that at The Atlantic. But now let's get to a man who's thought about this a lot and what it means, and you should read his piece about it, which is linked in the show notes, as I remind us many times, at jurist.org. titled "The Supreme Court's Radical Second Amendment Jurisprudence is Sowing Chaos in the Lower Courts."
Bringing knowledge and gloom and a guest house too. He's got a Labrador dog, glad to give you a poo, 'cause he's the legal eagle.
Eric Segall.
Eric Segall.
If you want, Pete, if you want to say fresh out of the ER from plumbing issues, my guest is here. If you want to do something like that.
And here he is now, fresh out of yet another ER visit. Loves that ER had some plumbing issues, but he is back and all cleaned out. Is that right?
I'm considering suing Clarence Thomas for causing my plumbing issues because I am so upset, agitated, annoyed, and actually desperately sad about what's happening in this country. I'm not really going to sue Clarence Thomas, but his handiwork didn't help my psychological well-being on these issues.
Is there any correlation, any study that's been done that could connect these two issues, the decisions at the Supreme Court regarding guns and your plumbing?
Could be. The jury, as we say, is out.
All right, give us some background, and I'll give you some deep background, listener. Segall says you should call Ryan Bussey, who's the former firearms executive who joined to be an Eric in previous conversations, who wrote a great book called Gunfight. And Ryan was almost able to join us, but we couldn't make it work out. And I really wanted to get this conversation on the record. But the point of telling you that is it would have been a good idea. A, and B, it really is important to get his insights. So we talked about this before, obviously, but remind us about New York State Pistol and Rifle Association versus Bruin. It was decided last June, and you say the Supreme Court issued one of the most unusual and dangerous opinions in American history. We've talked about it before. Tell us whatever you want about it, and then tell us why we're talking about it now.
So that essay was in Jurist, which is a legal magazine that people can get at jurist.org or jurist.com.
It'll be linked in the show notes, Segall.
I don't know these things. Okay. One would think with my own podcast I would know about these things, but I don't.
Linked in the show notes. That's what you say. Linked, say it. Say it, Pete, for all your listeners, Pete, it's linked in the show notes.
It's linked in the show notes, I hear. We've never talked about this before because there wasn't a moment in time we could have talked about this, because what I want to talk about second is what's happening in lower courts since last June. And there's been, and especially in the last month, a whole bunch of new things happening. So this is not repeating old things. I want to get to new things. But before we get to new things, you're right, we have to go back to old things. But before we talk about what I call one of the worst and most radical decisions in American history, the gun decision from last June, I want to talk about constitutional law in general, because only if we get that on the table, Pete, will people understand how radical, how wrong, how terrifying this decision is. So we can debate originalism, we can debate living constitutionalism, we can debate textualism, all those different isms. We can debate a lot of things about con law. But there is one thing that has been true about constitutional law for a very long time. This is generally how it works. A plaintiff comes into a courtroom and says to a judge, the government is doing something to me that I think violates the Constitution, whatever it is, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Eighth Amendment, whatever. And the judge has to decide if that's what's happening, if the government is violating the Constitution. And the way it works, like 97% of the time, is the plaintiff says, my right to do something is really important, and you're infringing, regulating, prohibiting that right.
Like then getting married to the person I love.
Okay, so the same-sex marriage person, that debate, a gay person says, I want to be married. A gay man says, I want to be married to another man.
Stop hitting your table.
Sorry, I got excited. The government said, you can't. The gay man says, I have the right to do that. And then we have a con law case. And the way that usually works is, what is the plaintiff's right? How important is it? So in that case, the importance of marriage, no one denied. Even the people against same-sex marriage did not deny how important marriage is to people. So we know it's an important right. Then we ask, why is the government infringing that right? Why are they acting out of meanness? Is it vindictive? Is there some good reason? And then depending on the case, the government has different burdens of proof. If it's a political free speech case, like the Florida stuff that's about to happen in Florida, let's not get into that. But if we're talking about restricting speech that's political, the government has to have just an unbelievably important reason, And then the law has to be narrowly tuned to fulfill that reason because we believe in free speech in this country. You still can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And the reason assuming there's no fire, and the reason you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, because it is restricting speech, right? You're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, I have a right to free speech. I want to yell fire. You can't because the harm outweighs the right.
And if you do, here's the deal. At least you can't come back to this theater. You're not canceled. You can go to other theaters. You can do video on demand. But the truth is, I mean, I'm being funny, but I'm also being true. Like that theater can then decide because you put our other customers in danger.
Hold on. You can go to jail for doing it. Probably.
Sure, but even more important.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and so, for example, racial discrimination. When we're discriminating against traditionally disadvantaged groups, we don't want the government to almost ever do that. So they have to meet what's called a compelling interest test. They have to have the strongest of all interests. And for example, there was a case in California, Pete. I know this is far afield from guns, but give me 3 more minute leeway on this. There was a case in California where the California prison system separated whites, blacks, and all races for the first 60 days by race. This is like 10 years ago. Like this is recent times. And the reason California did that, they said, was because the violence and the gangs and if we separate for 60 days, there'll be less violence, less killings, less gang. And the Supreme Court said, well, and it was separate but equal. It wasn't separate but unequal. No one was, the black inmates were not complaining their cells were worse than white inmates. It wasn't like the old Brown versus Board of Education where the schools weren't equal. These were separate but equal facilities. They were. Nevertheless, the government said your reason for doing this is very strong, obviously, but not strong enough. And the right not to be separated on the basis of race trumps the government's interest. And that's how we do con law. That's how we do it. What is the government trying to do? What right is being infringed? Let's balance it. Happens all the time. It's 98% of con law cases. And that was true until last June. When last June in the Bruin case, Justice Thomas, now I want to be very personal and clear about this. One of the reasons it's a terrible decision is because he's just a terrible judge.
Every time you slam,
sorry,
you lose credibility. You lose. It's indecent.
Okay.
It makes me.
Justice Thomas deserves it, but okay, Pete. When Justice Rehnquist used to write a bad decision, and even Scalia sometimes, we would say we disagree with it. We don't think it's right, but it's an opinion like a judge would write. Okay, Justice Thomas writes terrible opinions by any standard. In other words, it's just incoherently terrible. But in any event, what the court held in Bruin last June for the first time.
New York State Pistol and Rifle Association v. Bruin last June.
It doesn't even matter what the case was about. I don't want to talk about it.
Okay.
Because there's a bigger fish to fry. And we've already talked about that.
Yeah, right.
What Thomas and the majority said was in Second Amendment cases, meaning gun cases, if there's a law being challenged, the judge is not allowed to ask, what's the purpose of this law? Why do we have this law? And does it trump the right being asserted? Which is the way we do all of constitutional law. Nope, can't do that anymore. What we have to do now is say, can the government put forward a law enacted around 1791 or maybe 1868, but the court was unclear about that. Basically, the ratification of the Second Amendment, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which applied the Second Amendment to the states. Are there laws around that time that are like this law? If there's not, the government loses. So it's a pure history test. Go find us other laws and tradition. If there have been laws passed in 1910, 1930, 1950, 1970, 1990, maybe, although we don't know the answer to that. So shortly after Bruin came out, a federal judge in Mississippi was faced with a law that disarms felons. Of course, we want our felons disarmed. This law's been on the books for a long time in the federal government.
A Mississippi federal judge facing a challenge to a longstanding federal ban on felons possessing guns was so frustrated that he asked the parties whether he should hire a professional historian to help him decide the case, candidly admitting that neither he nor the lawyers in the case were trained historians. You write at jurist.org, linked in the show notes.
More insane than that, because of course, okay, let me back up a second. Good, because if Adam Winkler or a real gun expert were here, they would say to me, a lot of our gun laws suck. Clark Nelly would say a lot of our gun laws suck. I'm not arguing with it. I don't know. I'm not an expert. Here's what I do know. Should the government have the discretion to say if you commit a felony, you don't get to have guns anymore? Obviously, yes. Just obviously, yes. So, and that's what we've always done. So, except it turns out that back in 1789, it's unclear if they did that. And so the Fifth Circuit Court of Soviet Empire, just recently held, as you and I have talked about, that being the federal government says if you are subject to a domestic relations protective order, meaning you can't go near your girlfriend, your wife, your whatever, domestic relations, then you have to give up your guns because you're the subject of a protective order, which wouldn't have been issued if you weren't a violent person, or at least maybe a violent person. Until we figure out if you're a violent person, we're taking away your guns. The Fifth Circuit, that law's been in the books for a while. The Fifth Circuit just a couple weeks ago struck it down and said, I'm not kidding, Pete. Domestic violence was not considered a crime in 1789 because women were property of
No, it didn't say that. Well, if it did say that, you're taking it out of context.
You think?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah? Prove it.
I don't want to prove it. I don't like your...
If we want to decide whether or not it is constitutional under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution for the government to say to a person subject to a domestic relations protective order, you have a constitutional right to own a gun, but you forfeit that right once you're subject to that protective order. Is that constitutional? The way we should do that, Pete, is we should say, okay, how much of a burden is this on people? How much is taking their guns away during this time going to affect them? How important is it that they have their guns? And then, on the other side, does it become much more likely that the victim or a potential victim of this person is going to be hurt? Now, it turns out, of course, that guns are used wildly disproportionately in domestic violence, that there's a complete linkage between domestic violence and owning guns. But we're not allowed to have that conversation. Well, the only conversation we're allowed to have is, can you find a similar law in 1789? Which raises the question, could the government take away someone's private nukes?
Take away someone's private
nukes, nuclear weapons. Right. Those are arms. Nuclear weapons are arms.
Nobody that's ridiculous. Nobody has private nuclear arms.
If they did, do you think the government would take it away?
No, because they should not be infringed upon. That is what Nathan.
You're getting my point here.
The great state senator, a Republican state senator from Oklahoma, Nathan Dunn, went viral on Friday for destroying Jon Stewart on his show, because he clearly explained to Jon Stewart, it was mostly about guns. I don't know if you saw this.
I did.
But that though any of your gun rights shall not be infringed upon. So you can make all the points you want about a domestic abuser and the correlation and the statistics that they're likely to commit violence and use a firearm, but you cannot infringe upon their right to have that firearm.
Just stop. I want you to stop.
It says it right there. It says it right.
I want you to stop right now.
That's what Nathan Dunn said.
Please read to your audience the First Amendment.
The First Amendment?
Google it and read it.
The first one?
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep saying that until I get it up so I don't have to make an edit.
Get it up and read it.
The First Amendment reads.
Yeah, just the beginning. This is taking Pete way too long.
The government.
Congress.
The United States Constitution prevents. No, it's not it.
Oh my God. Never mind. I'm going to say it. This was pathetic.
No, I'm going to find it. Congress shall make no law. I don't appreciate that. I don't teach I don't come to your con law class and knock the catheter out of your
low blow.
Congress shall make no
low blow. I want you to low blow there, Pete.
I can't hear you. You're breaking up. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech.
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Do you understand what the word no means in that sentence? Is the word no ambiguous to you?
What does this have to do with my right to?
It has everything. The person talking to Jon Stewart was using half the text of the Second Amendment to make the argument that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, saying, we're done, no more balancing, you have the right, it can't be infringed. Of course, he left out a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. But John didn't. No, but hold on, Pete. The fact that the Constitution says, even if there was no militia, even if it just said the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, that's a weaker statement than Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
It is a weak. I would agree with that,
because no means no, no means none, no means zero, no means you. There's not. But we know that in federal court, if you lie and you're caught lying, you can go to jail for perjury, and that's a law abridging freedom of speech. Why do we allow that when it says no in the First Amendment? No law, zero. But we allow people's rights to speak to be infringed in federal court when we say you can't lie. If you lie, you go to jail. You know why, Pete? Because we balance the importance of lying in court and how important that is against why the government doesn't want you to lie in court. And we all know the reasons for that. The rule of law, justice, innocent go free, guilty get convicted. So my point here is any reference to the text of the Second Amendment is irrelevant to this conversation. Unless you want to say a well-regulated militia is part of it, in which case we could stop this whole conversation, but the court has rejected that. So here's my point. Even though the First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law, we know it doesn't mean no law, and we still do balancing tests. We still do. Now, Justice Thomas, in his opinion, lied. What he said was this test about text and history but no balancing is what we do in the First Amendment. That's a lie. It's just a lie. He made a lying thing. Like judges lie, he lied. I'll tell you why. He is correct. I'm sorry that I'm ranting. I'm very riled up.
Well, you're hitting the table again.
Sorry. I'm sorry that I'm ranting and hitting the table. You have to understand I've had a tough week medically.
Oh, I know.
Pete, listen. Justice Thomas said that we do this in the First Amendment. And by this, he meant text and history and tradition, not balancing. That's a lie. What we do in the First Amendment is we say, is what you're doing protected by the First Amendment? So, for example, the big case in 1968 where a guy went into a courthouse in California with a jacket that said, fuck the draft. And they arrested him, saying you can't wear fuck the draft in the courthouse. And the Supreme Court said, first we have to figure out, is that speech? And then if it is speech, then we balance the government's reason for not allowing you to do that against the importance of the right. That first step, is this speech? I did it again. Is this speech? Is sometimes an historical test. But once you find out if it's speech, the case isn't over. Then the government says, but wait, we know it's speech. We admit that it's speech. But we don't want fuck the draft in our courthouse because it's disrespectful and it makes people upset. And the government and the court rejected that and said, those aren't good enough reasons. Those aren't good enough reasons to restrict speech. Notice the balancing. He wants to express his opposition to the Vietnam War. You don't want disruption in your courthouse, but there's no evidence of disruption in your courthouse until that evidence came in, different conversation. That's all about the facts. It's all about balancing. It's like saying, so New York's law in Bruin said to get a concealed carry permit, you had to show special cause. And the way that case should have been analyzed is assuming the Second Amendment creates a private right to own guns, which it doesn't, but assuming that it does, which the court assumed, then the question becomes, why is New York making people go through very big hurdles to get a concealed carry permit? And how much of an abridgment of that is that of the right? None of that was allowed to be discussed. Because all we're asking is, was this law similar to a law similar in 1791? Now, if there's any area of constitutional law where the historical test is the dumbest, stupidest, wrongest, most evil, pernicious thing, it's the Second Amendment. You know why? Because our guns today have nothing to do with the guns in 1791.
Right.
There's no Times Square in 1791. There's no Astrodome. That's a bad reference. There's no Superdome. That's a bad reference, too. There's no that new LA stadium, whatever it is.
You can't think of a big arena. Just name a giant corporation. I'm sure you'll land on one.
I'm too old. Actually, there are many.
Why are you naming a big space filled with people, and why are you naming a type of?
Because the people in 1791 did not have to grapple with an issue. Do we want guns in an indoor place that holds 100,000 people? That's a different. No, they never faced that question. It was never asked. They didn't have to engage with, nor did they have to address the question: what do we do with a weapon that can shoot? Whatever, fill in the blank here, 100 bullets in 3 minutes and kill 50 people, or a very, very small gun that you can put in your pocket, take out and kill 10 people.
Yeah.
That's not how muskets worked, Pete.
Or soon like a laser beam that you could just spin around and cut everybody in half. And I'm kind of joking, but not.
No, I understand. You're right. So, I mean, why would we put a history test on a continually evolving technology? That's A. More importantly, when we talk about, let's take that free speech case, which many people think, there were a lot of ACLU types, and I'm trying to think if someone's been on your show. Adam Winkler, who I think would say that case was unbelievably important, because what that case stood for was expression is more than speech, and that was political speech. Maybe it was fuck the draft, not fuck, but whatever it was. It was very important for that person to be able to display that message. And the harm caused by that message wasn't great. So we're going to say, no, he gets to display the message. Now, if there had been riots and deaths and murders and judges hanging themselves because of that message, we would have a different case. If we're going to talk about a citizen's right to own a gun, and what are the public safety implications of that right, we are at least addressing the real issue. But if we're asking whether this law has an analog in 1791,
right,
who the fuck cares?
Well, that's the originalist argument, right? But, just this brings up, I feel like we've never really talked about that. Who's written the book and who's the expert and who makes the argument about, forget about, to some extent, a living, breathing constitution, just to how technology changes rapidly and how courts and laws, and whether it be in the United States or anywhere else, need to be able to try to, and it's hard for government, much less judges, to keep up with how technology changes, whether it be telecommunications or weaponry or surveillance or anything that can infringe upon our rights, our privacy, and so on. Technology changes at such a rapid pace. Why is that why does that have to be so controversial?
But let me address that, Pete, but it's not a soundbite answer, and it's a little complicated. And I know for 100% certainty you and your audience can handle it. What originalists like to say about that issue is we're not stupid. Of course, the First Amendment applies to the internet, even though the internet didn't exist in 1789. But of course, the Constitution has to keep up with the times in that sense. And the fact that a certain type of speech didn't exist in 1791, or a certain type of gun didn't exist in 1791, doesn't mean it's not covered by the provisions that cover guns and speech. And that's fair, by the way. That's totally, I agree. We agree. We all agree. That's 100% true. And that's what they say. And then they stop. And then I raise my hand and I say, Randy Barnett, let me ask you a question. Randy, I agree. The First Amendment applies to the internet. Now let's talk about a very difficult issue about or just law applies to the internet. Now let's talk about a difficult issue. I'm in a basement in Anchorage, Alaska, and I have an internet business, and it sells 1 million things a year or 100,000 things a year. And someone in New York thinks that I did something wrong with my selling of their product, and they want to sue me in New York. I've never been to New York. I've never stepped foot in New York. I don't like New York. I don't want to go to New York.
No, you're an Alaskan.
Do courts have jurisdiction over me simply because I sold a product on the internet, not targeted at New York, but someone in New York bought? That turns out to be a question that no founding father could ever have had any opinion on. It doesn't mean that due process, because it violates due process to be hauled into a court where you have no connection. I've never been to Alaska. I've never done anything in Alaska. If I was sued in Alaska, my answer would be, you can't sue me there. It violates my constitutional rights. I've never been there. You have no jurisdiction over me. If I visited an Alaskan website that's hosted on the internet, does that change the formula? I don't know. The point is, there's nothing in originalism to help us answer that question.
But if you sold something to an Alaskan, or in your case, an Alaskan sold something to a New Yorker,
I think it's unclear. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. But the answer is not in 1791. Transgender folks, right? Whatever we're going to do with the future of transgender rights in this country, and I think it's actually some of those questions are more complicated. I think the question of a very burly 16-year-old trans female who was born with male genitalia and male chromosomes swimming on a girl's 10th grade team, that's a hard issue to me. I'm not saying it's right. I don't know what the answer is. I'm just saying it's hard. There's nothing in 1791 to help us with that. No source, no book, no Federalist paper, nothing. Now, let's go back to guns. What New York said, among other things, was we're a big state. And New York City has different needs than where you grew up, for example, in Syracuse. And Manhattan is different than where I grew up in Long Island, which was a suburban.
Where I grew up, if I had a machine gun, I wouldn't be able to kill anybody. And I mean nobody, because I lived far enough away.
Right,
and,
but in Times Square, you could kill a lot of people.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things they said was one size fits all isn't ideal, but it's a complicated state. Politics are difficult.
Yep.
So this is our state law. And a lot of this has to do with New York City. Even though it's a state law, it really was about Times Square, Broadway, Manhattan. So by the way, after the court struck that law down, this concealed carry law, New York passed a new law, which had a lot of different things in it, including prohibiting guns in churches and schools, which was upheld as there were laws like this back in 1791, whatever. But they also prohibited guns at summer camps. Struck down. I'm not making this up.
New York State Legislature prohibited guns in summer camps, and the Supreme Court struck that down?
No, a federal judge in New York struck it down. He said there's no analog to summer camps in 1791, basically. I know, it's unbelievable. And so the result of this is guns can be prohibited in New York in schools, but not in summer camps in New York. And if anyone thinks that makes sense, you're a moron.
So you're legally allowed to be a kid or a camper or an adult?
Well, there are age issues, but if you're a 27-year-old counselor at a summer camp, I believe you have a right to own a gun. It's unbelievable. And the reason we get that preposterous result is because we're not asking what's the reason for the law. Why don't we want guns in schools? Because there are kids there, we don't want to get killed.
Well, what if you're hiking in the Adirondacks like my daughters do and a bear comes out? You might want a rifle.
Okay.
I am.
By the way, rifles weren't covered by this law, just handguns, I believe.
Oh, well, you don't need a handgun.
My point is the following, and it's a big one. The way we do...
I think campers should be allowed to carry rifles.
The way we do constant... I went to camp in Poughkeepsie, New York. I went there for 2 years. I had my first kiss.
My daughter's, a camp counselor in Lake George, and my other daughter is a camper there. And
that's where I went. But my camp's now a day camp.
And she got in trouble for last year when she was a counselor because she allowed the kids to be divided for like 15 minutes, and the two were sleeping, and she didn't want to wake them up. And so she went down and got the other ones, and they said, "You left these two kids," and she's like, "They were sleeping. I was walking like 5 minutes away." So those are the kind of strict rules they have at that camp. So I guess they probably don't allow rifles.
There's nothing I'd rather do than start talking about my personal 1971 summer camp experience, but I don't think that's the point of this.
All right, well, go ahead. Finish up.
But I would love to do that. How we know that my first girlfriend and my first kiss, both from 1971 summer camp at Gibson, New York, was on my podcast.
That's right. It sounds like you are talking about it, though.
Okay, I'm not talking about it anymore. Let's just forget everything we've ever learned about law, and let's just talk common sense. I hate that phrase. I hate that phrase. I assert a right to do something that I think the Constitution protects. The government says, nope, you don't have that right. We're either going to punish you for doing it, or we're going to stop you from doing it. We're going to regulate this right. You don't get to do what you want to do. As a matter of common sense, the next question would be, okay, why is this person asserting this right? How important is it? Because rights have different importances. And why is the government trying to stop them from doing this? And now, in my personal world, what a judge would say is, I'm going to side with the government unless the plaintiff has a really strong case. But in the real world that exists in real life, what courts do is they second guess legislatures all the time. But they second guess legislatures all the time because what they say is the reason for the law is not sufficient for the infringement of the right.
Right.
That analysis, Pete, is no longer allowed in Second Amendment cases, which is why the judge in Mississippi said, I don't know history. My law clerk doesn't know history. If you want me to go back to 1791 and do a careful, reasonable, thorough analysis, I need a freaking historian. All of which, though, begs the question, why in the world, and this is what I really wrote about, this is so anti-democratic, Pete. We, the people today, should get to decide what's the proper balance between gun rights and gun safety. And if we make that balance wrong, the court can overturn us. But mostly what works in Montana is not what works in Times Square, doesn't work in Savannah, Georgia, or Austin, Texas. So it's anti-democratic in two different ways. Wait, let me just finish this one thought. It's anti-democratic in two serious ways. First, it's anti-federalism because Tulsa, Oklahoma is not Times Square. And the balance between gun rights and gun safety is going to be different in those places. But the court is requiring a one-size-fits-all. See, it no longer matters what the difference is between Times Square and Tulsa. The only thing that matters is, was there a similar law in 1791, which is insane. Two, it is anti-democratic because we're relying on the values of people who lived in 1791, not the values of people who live today. And the real problem with that is in 1791, guess who wasn't allowed to own guns? Everybody but white males, right? I mean, slaves couldn't own guns. Women, I don't think, could own guns. So we are incorporating in 2023 a set of principles, values, institutions, and technologies that have no reference to 2023. Yet, Justice Thomas tells us we're not allowed to ask, why is the government trying to do this? The only thing we can ask is, historically, has the government done this? And if that applied to all constitutional, by the way, if that principle, this is the last point I'm going to make, if that principle applied to all of constitutional law, we'd be back to 1923 and there'd be no federal government.
Well, we're on our way.
We are.
I guess just one final question that I have that comes up about. I keep thinking about that Jon Stewart argument with that guy.
Yeah,
and it just he brings up their argument.
You once got me tickets for Jon Stewart.
What's that?
You once got Lynn and I tickets for Jon Stewart.
Oh, is that right? That's how long we've been friends. Wow,
it was great. Yep,
man. You once got somebody tickets, I think, for the Forbes Theater when you were younger. So I'm just paying it forward.
The Forbes Theater.
Whatever.
You mean where Lincoln was shot?
I don't know what I was.
That was an age joke. Someone who's been in the ER twice in the last 10 days and has had unconscionable things done to his body, you are making feel older. Okay.
I don't even know what you're talking about. What do courts, what is the court's role in protecting the safety and security, say, of children? So if a drug is killing a lot of kids, if car accidents are killing a lot of kids, or if some disease is killing a lot of kids, like at what point are courts allowed to step in and say, hey, government is not doing a good enough job at protecting the kids? Because it's not a hypothetical, because guns are the leading cause of death for adolescents in America. And so the guy kept arguing about the Second Amendment, but I was like, can we just put the Constitution aside for a moment and say, what is the role of courts? And I guess you can't, but in the safety and security of, in this case, kids, adolescents, if the government, the state or the federal government is not doing anything. So,
Peter, without concrete facts, that's a hard hypo, but I want to pick on something you said. Put the Constitution aside, you said. Let's just talk about this, which, by the way, that's what the court does. Liberals, conservatives, moderates, they don't take the Constitution seriously anyway, but they don't. They never had. The Warren Court didn't, and the Roberts Court doesn't.
Right.
But wait, here's what I want to say to you about that, though, and it's pretty important. The Founding Fathers had a view of constitutional rights that are 180% the opposite of Justice Thomas's views on the Second Amendment. And I want to make that point to show you how far afield we are. Justice Thomas says he's an originalist. He has said it consistently since he came to the bench in 1991. So that's 32 years. I'm an originalist. I'm an originalist. I'm an originalist. In 1789, this was the idea of rights. And I'm going to name some names. You can read Judd Campbell. You can read Saul Cornell, who is the former chair of the history department at Fordham, a true historian. I will admit a bleeding heart liberal, but a true historian. And Saul and Judd's historical work, among many others, tell us that in 1789, what they thought was all rights, all of them, have to be balanced against the public good. So that if the government is going to infringe upon your right, that's only the first question. The next question is why? And if the public interest was served by that government law, then it would be upheld. So Justice Thomas is employing a method of constitutional analysis that is the most living constitutionalism method of analysis there could possibly be. Because not a single soul alive in 1789 or 1868, when the Reconstruction Amendments were passed, would have said what Justice Thomas is suggesting is the way judges should decide cases. The irony of that, right, you're laughing. The irony of that should just be despair causing for people. He's doing exactly the opposite of what he says he is. Exactly the opposite. It is so frustrating. And I'm not the only person saying this. So the Duke Law School, one of the top 10 law schools in the country, has a firearms center. And the person who used to run that center, and it was nonpartisan. It was, it was actually
that did what? Looked at laws around firearms?
Yeah. Everything. It was a Second Amendment firearms legal center. The chair of that, the head of that, is now a professor at Pepperdine as of last year. He just wrote a 80-page law review article on the Bruen case. This is a man who spent his last 8 years trying to be neutral about gun rights and gun policy, because that was his job as head of this center. It was a nonpartisan center. Pete, he's more angry about this than I am.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I want to read that, or a summary of it.
Come on your show. Jake Charles. He's great.
Okay.
Charles. But he's more an expert than I am on this. And his article, which I cite in that essay that I had,
that's linked in the show notes.
When you read his law, and his is a formal law review article, that's written for Duke Law Journal.
Yeah, so I probably won't read it.
You should, because it's written for everybody. When you read that, you can just feel his hands on the typewriter doing what I was doing a minute ago. Yeah. He's so angry.
I'll link to that too. I got to find that. I'll link to that as well.
Because Pete, this is so irresponsible. And so I'm going to close with this. In 2008, there was an issue, bear with me. In 2008, there was an issue with the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. And the issue was, do aliens who we picked up in Afghanistan or Yemen or wherever, who were holding in Guantanamo Bay, have the right to habeas corpus, which is the right to have a judge say if you're legally imprisoned.
Aliens? Who the hell says that? You mean foreigners? Jesus Christ.
They're called, in the case, they're called aliens.
Well, they shouldn't be. Fucking
they're non-American citizens.
Okay, thank you. God damn.
The 5-4 decision written by Justice Kennedy, the liberals plus Kennedy, they said that because we have total control over Guantanamo Bay, they do have habeas corpus rights. All right. In dissent, Justice Scalia says people are going to die because of this decision. What he said. He was wrong, I think, it turns out. But he said people are going to die. At oral argument, in not Heller, which was the first case, and not Bruen, which is the last case, but the middle case, the McDonald case, which applied the Second Amendment to the states, because the District of Columbia versus Heller, D.C. is not a state. It's part of the federal government. So the issue was, does this apply to Illinois? The answer was yes. At oral argument, one of the lawyers for Illinois said more people are going to die if you strike down this handgun law. And Scalia said, I don't care. That's what the Constitution says. The inconsistency in those two things is astonishing, but that's not my point. Because of Justice Thomas's absurd reformulating of how constitutional law works in the Bruen case, more people are going to die. And I'm being deadly serious.
Well, you're allowed to say it because he did. But just to be clear, in Guantanamo Bay, where they had these, who they thought at least were detained terrorists, Scalia thought if you give them their rights, then more people will die. And they didn't. No more people didn't die as a result. I'm not sure which case, if any of them went back to the battlefield, but they didn't most likely. But the other thing he said was on Heller, right? You're saying that he said McDonald, what Scalia said was told people will die as a result of this, and he said I don't care, and people have died as a result. So he he warned of death where there wasn't any, and was warned of death. And said there wouldn't be any, and there has been. Yes,
exactly. But my point is, looking at these lower court cases, and by the way, according to Professor Charles, who has studied this in depth, there have been over 100 state and federal judges wrestling with these issues since last June. That's 8 months? That's a lot of cases, Pete. That's a lot of laws being challenged.
A lot of cases.
And they don't know what to do. So we're getting conflicting results. We're getting all kinds of weird things. I want people to, this protective order, civil protective order thing, think about it. This guy had 5 episodes of alleged violence, had threatened his girlfriend. There was a protective order saying you can't go near her. Under federal law, that means you don't get to own a gun. And the Fifth Circuit says that federal law is unconstitutional. Right. It's and in the context of domestic violence, especially, it's so people are going to die in Texas because of it.
Yeah, and domestic violence is a gender issue overwhelmingly. It's women who are the victims of.
Do you know what judge? So there's a judge in the Fifth Circuit. We've talked about him before, named Judge Ho. Judge Ho is worse than Clarence Thomas, which is hard to believe.
How dare you? Wow.
Yeah, and Judge Ho, he wrote a concurring opinion. He wants to be in the Supreme Court. He's one of those judges, and he wrote a concurring opinion that was awful. By the way, the Fifth Circuit has added. They issued their opinion. It was so controversial. It's in the Times, the Post, it was everywhere. People were like, what are you talking about? So they reissued their decision. They didn't make it any better. He reissued his decision. This is what he said. I'm not making this up, Pete. He said it's really easy to get protective order. And often when one party to a marriage or a relationship gets a protective order, the other person gets a protective order. So what this law is really doing is disarming poor women who get their guns taken away when their mean, violent husbands file a protective order against them.
I wonder if that's even ever happened.
Well, there's 2 things I want to say about it. I think it's highly suspicious reasoning, but it doesn't matter. Justice Thomas told us, and he told us in the first 2 pages of his opinion, that policy concerns don't count. We don't care if it's effective. That's not what we're asking. We're asking, is there a law like this in 1791? So in the middle of his opinion, he does something that's completely inconsistent with everything he said before because, and this is my point, he knows in his heart that the real issue here is the right, how important is the right versus how serious is the infringement. The issue is not, did they have laws like this in 1791?
Right.
It's so frustrating. And you and I have talked about a lot of issues, abortion, affirmative action, campaign finance. Of all the issues we've ever talked about, there is no issue more local than gun control and gun rights. There just isn't, because it matters. I'm not really that worried about people having rifles in rural Kansas. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. I'm very worried about rifles in Times Square. They're different cases, and the same rules shouldn't apply to both. Now, if somebody wants to go on Main Street in a rural town in Topeka, Kansas, and argue against President Biden, and he wants to do the same thing in Times Square, that's basically the same thing. It's someone wanting to speak politically. The locality doesn't really matter. Now, there's time, place, and manner restrictions in Times Square that might be more interesting than in Topeka, Kansas. But it's the same issue.
Right.
When it comes to gun rights and gun safety and public safety, it's not the same issue. It's not. Right. And so we get decisions like New York can prohibit guns in schools, but not summer camps, because there were no summer camps in 1791. By the way, where do you think wealthy kids went for the summers in 1791?
I wonder. I think that they had people build them and a moat. But I wonder if there's other examples. There's a million other examples. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, the one that comes quickly to mind is you can't have a 75-mile-an-hour speed limit on 6th Avenue and Manhattan. But you absolutely can have. I got no problem with you having it on Interstate 95. But because in one case, if you drive 80, you could kill so many people.
Right.
And in another case, if you drive 80, you might kill yourself. You might kill somebody else, but not a lot of people, not, pedestrian. I mean, it's just, there aren't people.
And that's a great example. You should be a law professor. But also, there was no analog to Times Square in 1789. There just wasn't.
Right.
I mean, there were crowded places, but not with hundreds of New Year's Eve in Times Square.
Right.
There's no equivalent.
Well, that concert in Vegas where the 70 or so people were killed.
That too. But we're making it more complicated anyway. All of that is true. But I hope everyone listening to this, and even those who are strongly in favor of the Second Amendment, our friend Keith Kaplan, I'm sure, if he listens to this.
I don't think he listens anymore.
He does. I can tell you he does. But in any event, a musket is not an AK-47. Next. A musket is nothing like an AK-47. And
you're a real gun expert over there, huh?
I know. And the internet is not like a local newspaper in 1789. So what rules would apply to newspapers in 1789 may or may not apply to the internet today. And what rules apply to guns in 1789 might or might not be good rules today. How complicated is what I just said?
Or cars. They didn't have cars.
Right. Right. I mean,
no cars. I mean, that's why I always go back to technology that they didn't have. We had guns. There were guns then. Yes. They could have possibly, but there weren't cars.
By the way, the other thing that
there wasn't email.
The other thing that Saul Cornell and Adam Winkler have both written, and it's so strong, is the Second Amendment was never enforced in federal court until 2008, not as a final thing.
Right.
But there have been state cases under 43 states over 40 states have state constitutions protecting gun rights. So because of that, we have a rich history of state case law involving the balance of gun rights and gun safety. And what Adam Winkler wrote in his great book is that's the history of guns in this country. It's not no guns, obviously, and it's not any laws allowed. The history is, at the state level, the history is you want a gun, we think it's dangerous for you to have a gun, and a judge will decide whether under the state constitution, which is more important. That balancing is the history of the gun controversy in this country until last year. When that balancing is now off the table, not allowed, by an originalist who is forwarding a constitutional analysis that no one in 1789 would have recognized. And part of the reason for this is he's a nut, but part of the reason is he's just a terrible judge who doesn't know how to write a good decision. That's really true. I just, by the way, saw on a separate point that Justice Thomas has hired, he hires law clerks 2 years in advance. So his law clerks coming next year and law clerks coming the year after that. And half of them are coming from Judge Pryor in Alabama. Judge Pryor is the guy who hired the woman who allegedly said, "I hate black people. I hate them." More good news about Justice Thomas.
Well, there's nothing better. There's nothing.
I would like, I would like, Pete. It would make me so happy if it came. No, I shouldn't say it. Never mind.
Well, I was just going to say, white supremacy is very effectively held up when you get a black person to do it. Sexism and patriarchy are very effectively held up when you get a woman, like they got now, that prime minister in Italy.
So Thomas replaces Marshall, a black right-wing conservative for a black progressive, and Barrett replaces Ginsburg.
Right. Perfect example. Better example. Yeah.
And by the way, as I've said to you many, many times, but I can't stress it enough. If Bill Clinton, if somebody in Justice Marshall's orbit in 1990, late 1990, says to him, that governor from Arkansas, that upstart, that young kid from Arkansas who gave a great speech at the Democratic convention and is running for president, he really might win. He really might. Marshall might have said, "Oh, well, I'm going to hang on," because he was really sick. "I'm going to hang on until the election." But that's not what he was told. what he was told was Bush is going to win easily. It's going to be an easy re-election for Bush. So now you're looking at 4 more years. And there's no way Marshall at his age he couldn't have, in fact, he died a year later. He wasn't going to hang on. If Marshall just hangs on 10 more months, it's a 10-month situation, just like 9 or 10 months, then Clinton gets 3 picks instead of 2. There's no Citizens United. There is no Heller. There is no...
No, this exercise is not worth doing. It's depressing.
It is. And again, if changing judges changes law, do we know what law is?
If changing judges changes law, do we know what law is, ladies and gentlemen?
You know who said that? I got to say this. Oh. Guess who said that?
Was it a Supreme Court scholar?
No.
Was it a judge?
Yep.
If changing
judges changes law, do we even know what law is?
Give me a time frame.
I'll give you a hint. It's somebody I always talk about.
Oh, it was. It's Judge Posner.
It's Judge Posner.
Yeah. Well, I almost thought we were out of here without him.
You know why? That's why I said it. You know why he was so great? I say was because he has Alzheimer's. He was so great because he said exactly what he meant in as few words as possible. If changing judges changes law, do we even know what law is? What a brilliant... I don't have an answer to that question, by the way. That question has bedeviled philosophers for generations. But it's the right question to ask about the Supreme Court of the United States. Because in most states, traditionally, changing judges did change law a little bit, but not like it changes it at the Supreme Court.
That's so interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yep. So all we do is replace Marshall and Thomas, and world history is different.
Well, get your time machines, everybody.
Yeah.
Come on, get your time machine.
Thank you for letting me rant. This Bruin decision is really just, on every level, just horrific.
Read more about it. Look the show notes. Read the article. Read the articles that he links to. Eric Segall.
Before we leave, I have one more confession to make.
Uh-oh. Go ahead.
So during this podcast, you correctly... criticize isn't the word I'm looking for. You correctly made fun of me and asked me to stop banging on my desk, which is a fair statement and request to make. During my own podcast, I have learned that the only way for me to not do what you just wanted me not to do, and what I've been doing for the last 8 minutes, is sitting on my hands.
Oh, you can sit on your hands. Oh.
There is no other way.
Well, I didn't realize that. We have to get a wider angle shot for the next time. That's good technique.
No
That's good technique.
I use my shoulders. I'm not using my hands. I'm going to use my shoulders.
Well, we love how animated you are and how brilliant you are and how expressive you are. So I'm sorry to make it just makes a very loud noise and is an audio
One
medium.
Shouldn't be banging the desk.
Audio medium. It's like they should give Segall just a symbol as he's making his points. All right, my friend. Thank you very much. That was awesome as always.
Thank you, Pete. Love you, man.
All right, there he goes, Eric Segall, everybody. Eric Segall, the legal eagle. Yeah. Good stuff. I hope you liked it and appreciated it, and hopefully we'll get Ryan Bussey on to comment on it and let Eric know that you heard it. Go to eSpin Segall on Twitter. Go follow him on TikTok. Get his books, listen, and subscribe to his podcast, Supreme Myths. I bet that's the best thing you can do. And just for a little special treat here at the end for all you bumblebees, folks who listen all the way to the end. You're a bumblebee. Did you know that? That's what I call you. Some of you know. Here's a special treat because Gareth Sever, very talented musician, performer, subscriber, listener, friend, and one half of Buckets and Boards. He is a pro. He writes jingles and songs about us and our guests, often in the moment at the Hangouts. And, well, this one he wrote over a little bit longer period of time because this is about Eric Segall and his wife, Lynn, and their guest house. For years, it's been an ongoing bit that I teased him that he had a guest house after visiting him one time just outside Atlanta there where he lives. I realized he literally has a guest house behind his house, and I kept calling it that, and he referred to it as a shack or a shed or a garage that is not being used, which is how they used it. Anyway, they finally admitted that's what it was because they knocked it down and they realized they can no longer hide it. And Lynn fed me the files, the pictures, all of it, the documents. He basically admitted it. And so they came to the Hangout and Gareth unveiled this song. If you were there, you might have heard it, but it's better quality audio now because he was just playing over Zoom. He sent me the file of him recording it. So here at the end, for you bumblebees, here is that hilarious song by Gareth Sever about Eric and Lynn and their guest house.
Professor Segall's guest house. Well, I'll shoot straight. Your level of honesty is not on par with your golf ability. However, your insatiable integrity is validated by your fancy law degree. So you say you're tearing down your guest house that doesn't exist still. The mythological backyard building seems to endlessly persist in the songs of yore. Pete Cole settled the score, proving Dominic's irreverent references that laid out the lore. Till just the other day, in the middle of bearing your soul, you couldn't resist stating that the truth must be told. You're tearing down your guest house to build another guest house. Who would have guessed this is how the facts would come out? To be fair, the way it's laid out is less of a guest house, more of a rental, as the professor surely knows. Proper wording is elemental. They'll be renting it out to students at the local university, with tons of fine print stating that the students will take care of their dogs for free, because they'll be on vacation in some tropical locale where their vacation home even has a guest house of its own. This may or may not be true, could be totally wrong, but the tradition of exaggerating guest houses continues to live on and on, because they're tearing down their guest house to build another guest house. Who would have guessed this is how the facts would come out? And now, just so you know, we're all making plans to visit, knowing full well we'll just be showing up to guinea pig sit and maybe adopt it and probably go home with it to our very own guest house. Just kidding, we don't have your kind of clout, but when we sleep, perchance we'll dream of someday owning our very own fake real guest house.
There he is, Gareth Sever, Buckets and Boards. I'll link to him in the show notes. And thank you so much for listening to today's program. I'll talk to you Monday. Now get outside, unless you already are.